Hello and welcome to the video guide for your rat deck, Wick the World Mind. Coming into this, I'm not 100% sure how in depth I should be because there are a lot of things that I wish someone had told me when I first started. And I was kind of having an internal debate on if it is better for me to touch on each of those things as the video goes on, or just stick to strictly what is relevant with this specific deck. And I think ultimately what makes the most sense is doing a bit of both. So I think a good place to start is color identity. And you'll have to forgive me because I don't fully know what you know, and of course, I don't want to be overly redundant. So I'll try to just stick to the stuff that's the most essential that that someone would understand when coming into a deck that is three colors. Because this commander, although they are black in their mana cost up here, their activated ability, because it has three different mana types in it, makes this a Grixis commander, a blue, black, red commander, colloquially known as Grixis. And so coming into it, each of those colors is known for their own distinct thing. Blue being, of course, like control, card draw. Black is like using life as a resource, reanimator effects. Red is just in all ways aggro. You'll be hard pressed to find a control deck in red most of the time. Sometimes it's done. There are some red-black examples. But in this case, it's not relevant. And we know it's not relevant because I purposefully kept the instance amount low, just because Magic is complicated enough as it is. I'm not 100% sure how Hearthstone functions. It's essentially, like, your creatures can't really block. Like, combat is more like I do my thing, then you do your thing. And Magic is all about interacting with other people, as I'm sure you know, because you've played multiple games at this point. And normally, having a lot of instants can be a great thing when it comes to interacting with the state of the game. But for the goal of this deck, I wanted to make you something that inherently is fun to play with as the person piloting it. It's fun to play against, and you can just focus on your game plan, and you'll win a good amount of games, because the way the deck is built, what we gave up being the instance, what we gained was consistency in our game plan. Because a lot of these decks that have a ton of interaction, they're compromising on their specific synergy pieces for their deck so that they can pack that interaction. And personally, especially when it comes to a synergy-based deck, one that does rely on very specific components, I've always been someone who subscribes to the idea that I'd rather have more threats to play than cards that are trying to prevent three other people from interacting with me, because that's just part of the game. They're gonna interact with you if you're doing threatening things, and sure, it's great to have that back pocket counter spell when you need it, but even better, I would argue, is to have a way to recur the thing they got rid of, or a way to play another thing, and they just wasted their counter spell on your first threat. But if you keep presenting threats, one of you is going to run out of gas first. Either you run out of your synergy pieces, or they'll run out of their suite of removal. And most people cannot afford to run enough removal to prevent you from executing your game plan when you have a deck that's built around an engine like this. But anyways, that's enough of that introduction. I just wanted to address immediately that this deck is notably light on instant speed spells, with the exception being I just love the card Battle Hymn. I had a snake deck a while ago, and if you have even like 3 or 4 creatures out, it's just being able to net mana with this there will be a good amount of times where there's a good amount of cards in this deck that have an X cost. It's Song of Totes and Tans. I'm still not 100% sure how to pronounce this. Create X rats. Exactly what we want to do. Stargaze notably has a rat in the art over here. Oh, where'd it go? Okay, well, just like I'm playing a game of Operation trying to get through there. Notably has a rat in the art. But yes, these have X costs. We don't have a ton of ways to generate mass amounts of mana, but something like Battle Hymn, something like a Mana Geyser, these are cards that are going to pretty much at any state of the game, they will give you all the mana you need to play the cards in your hand. But we also have other stuff that helps with making sure you're able to play your cards. Just to go along the lines of like mana generation. These are two political tools as well. And I'm not sure if I said it, and I'm not sure if it's obvious, but I'll just say it because I don't mind stating the obvious, and I'd rather say it than not. When I say politics, I specifically mean cards that allow you to easily interact with your opponents in a way that can be mutually beneficial, or it can encourage like deals. In this case, although Descent into Avernus is a very threatening card in its own right, because, just to quickly touch on it, at the beginning of your upkeep, you put 2 counters on it, and then each player creates X treasure tokens, and Descent into Avernus deals X damage to each player, where X is the number of counters on it. So, first turn it's out, first go around. Well, I probably should touch on first. A treasure token, it's a quick burst of mana. It's like a land that you can use one time and then it's gone. But yeah, your first go around you get 2 treasure tokens. Second go around you get 4. Your third go around you get 6. Now, to do the math real quick, no one likes math, but I'll quickly say it. The first 2 go arounds, you've dealt 2 damage to everyone at the table, including yourself. Then you deal 4 damage, so now you've dealt 6 damage to everyone at the table. And the turn after that, you deal another 6, so you've dealt now 12 damage to everyone at the table, out of a total of 40 life. So it's easy to see how this card can get out of hand very quickly. You do have a couple like safety valves in this deck, because although it is fun every now and then to just have this card out and have it do its thing, and then, everyone's just, the ship is sinking rapidly, and the chaos that can come from people having a ton of mana and the game being threatened to end quickly, it can be a very fun time. But I did specifically, one of the interactions I wanted to point out was Displacer Kitten with Descent into Avernus. So notably, Displacer Kitten, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you get to exile up to 1 target non-land permanent, and then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. This is really good because it can protect itself. It can cause your other rats to trigger your commander, buffing up your snail, making you draw more cards as a result of it, because now your snail's stronger. But also, when Descent into Avernus gets exiled and then returns, it returns with 0 counters on it. So if you ever are in a position where you have Descent into Avernus on the battlefield and it starts to really just dial up, crank up the oven heat and cook the table, then at the very least you do have a card in your deck that will make it so it doesn't have to, the game doesn't just have to end as a result of this card you played. You can't take it back. So long as you have a non-creature spell, of which there are, just at a glance, like 37 in the deck, you'll be okay. And so moving on from that, we've talked about Descent into Avernus, but another card that's a good political tool that generates a lot of mana is Mana Flare. This is typically considered to be a group hug deck, which is like a deck that wants to, as the name implies, hug the group, help everyone out, make life easier. A lot of people, it's a surprisingly controversial deck archetype, because there are some people who believe that they don't actually have a win condition, that helping everyone at the table doesn't allow your deck to do the thing you built it to do. It's just kind of an accelerated version of it. It doesn't give you an accurate like assessment of what you're trying to do. And if you have people at your table who share that sentiment, it is perfectly reasonable that, you know, you could swap this out with any of the enchantments that we have in the considering pool that are less like group oriented, ones that just help yourself. I just remember, I was just thinking about one. Like, I mean, even something like night dealings, where you're dealing damage with your commander, gives you counters that you can then use to like search up cards. These are all great options. We can cross that bridge if you get to it. So, once again, because I'm not familiar with your experience and what all that you know with the game of Magic, I will try to, when I say a term, to pause and then say what it means right after. It just always annoys me when I'm new to something and someone's like, "Oh yeah, well, you know, at the in the early game when they tutored and then they staxed me out," like, it's like, come on, man, I just began. Like, cut me a break. So I don't want to be that person for you. Anyways, back to the guide. Mana Flare, it's a great card to have at the table, not just because it benefits yourself. You know, benefiting your opponents. I think a lot of people tend to view their opponents as, well, people they're trying to beat. And of course that is true, but Commander's unique as a game format because, yes, they're your opponents, but they're also your allies. There are times where you, by having this card on the battlefield, are enabling another player's game plan. And you don't have to make a deal with them per se, but they will be more inclined to keeping you around if you're making their life easier, if you're helping out the table, especially if another person's in the lead. Like, if you drop a Mana Flare and then the person next to you is kind of behind, like, they're going to be, like, overjoyed. And then if the person who's really far ahead, you know, everyone suddenly is they're not going to look at you for playing this card. They're going to look at that person who's really far ahead and they're going to be like, oh, crap. They're, you know, going to run away with the game. We have to deal with them. They're not going to turn to you and say, and you know, and come for you. It's kind of part of the interesting nuance of the format. But anyways, moving on from that, I just wanted to touch on it real quick because I feel like this is a card that doesn't get a lot of love. And it's just a great include in a deck that wants to foster a fun experience with, you know, friends. So a card that doesn't do that, that's in here because there's a classic thing in Magic where people will say you should never build a deck without a win condition. And although your commander certainly is a win condition because, as you know, we've touched on their ability, you can sacrifice snails, deal damage equal to their power, and we'll touch on some of the best cards for this ability in the deck shortly. So some people would say that's a win condition in and of itself, but a win condition many Magic players are familiar with is Impact Tremors. It's surprising how quickly you can take over, like you can just shut out a game if you are able to make a lot of creatures very quickly. I wanted this deck to have the capability to accelerate as you get more comfortable with the game, as you learn how to best play situations, what hands to keep, all that stuff. You know, how the deck likes to operate in the early game, the mid game. I wanted you to have the tools when you became comfortable, as you talked about, to kind of to grow. You know, like how a plant, you know, can only grow as big as its pot. I wanted to make sure that you wouldn't run into a scenario where the deck just gets stale because it's done everything it can do, and, you know, now what kind of deal. This is kind of like a backup win condition. I've never been a fan of infinite combos, of which there are a good amount in Magic, but I've coined a term in my friend group called not infinite, well, it's more of a saying, not infinite, but a lot. So having an Impact Tremors out, as we just touched on, and then casting like a Mana Geyser with 3 other people at the table, real quick, sorry, just getting a drink of water. Mana Geyser will give you red mana for each tapped land your opponents control regularly if you are able to cast this. We're assuming it's like turn 3, turn 4, turn 5, or later. Typically turn 4, 5, or later. Not even like overestimating. You will probably generate 9 to like 13 mana. And that's assuming there is no green at the table. The color green is notorious for, well, playing a lot of creatures, but also playing a lot of lands. Green does a bit of everything, but it especially is good at putting a ton of lands into play. So the average game in a lot of commander decks will include some green decks at the table. And all that is just to say that if you cast this spell the second you are able to, oftentimes you will generate like 12 to 15 mana, but I regularly, when I cast Mana Geyser, get 18 to 24 mana. Like, because you don't have to cast it just the moment you can. You could just save it until you draw Song of, T. I'm not going to try to say that name again. Or Stargaze. And this card, although it's not a tutor, which is a term in Magic used to describe a card that lets you search for a card and then put it in your hand, this is functionally the same as a tutor. And we do have an example of one of those in your deck, so I'll touch on that right after this. Being able to look at the top 20, top 16, or just by putting 8 mana into X, it's not searching your deck for anything, but picking one out of the top 16, it's a great spot to be in. So we were just talking about tutors. Actually, I should finish the thought on Mana Geyser, then I'll touch on the tutor. So just being mindful of when you play Mana Geyser. There's a classic thing in Magic, a trope, an idea that if there's a blue player at the table and they have 2 blue mana open, that you need to, air quote, play around counterspell. And this doesn't always mean the spell, counterspell, because that does exist. There are multiple versions of that spell that share a similar cost. There are some that are 1 mana, there are some that are 0 mana, but in most friendly groups of people, also known as just groups, also known as pods, in most pods, you're not going to encounter free counter magic unless it's like very specific. But I don't know your group, so I just wanted to give you the heads up. That's something people do. But yes, being mindful of the color of mana that is open to people. And it's okay to ask. Like, if you aren't able to tell how much mana someone has available, asking, hey, how much mana do you have available? There's a rule in Magic that any publicly available information must be shared if, asked. So, for example, I couldn't ask you, what cards are in your hand, but I could ask you if there are any creatures in your graveyard, and you would have to tell me and, be truthful kind of deal. But so long as you're playing around a counterspell, this card almost assuredly will allow you to just dump your hand on the table. And as I touched on earlier, its synergy with Song of T and Impact Tremors, it's not a combo in the sense of it ends the game. Well, it is a combo. It's not an infinite combo. It's not infinite, but a lot, as I said earlier. And so moving on from this, I decided to put in some cards that people would argue are perhaps not the best at what they do, but I have had great experiences with these cards that people are always surprised to, 1, see these cards because they're rare, and 2, how effective they are for what you want to do with, for example, a card draw spell. Manifold Insights is effectively look at the top 10 of your deck, and then your opponents pick the worst 3 cards from the top 10. And that's if you're not talking with the other players at the table. If you factor in the political elements of this deck, the fact that you have a Mana Flare in this deck, the fact that you have Humble Defector in this deck, something people actively want on the table, this card becomes better because of the other cards in your deck. Like, for example, Coveted Jewel. This is a great card on the table, even if my opponent plays it. As a matter of fact, I'm happy if my opponent plays it, because I can get it myself. I can draw 3 when I deal damage to them, and now I have a Mana Rock that taps for 3. So casting Manifold Insights, if you ever just have 3 mana and you don't know what to do, or you're torn between options, this card is almost always one of the best options. It's just so consistent, and the fact that it's non-lands, like if you got 6 lands out of the top 10, you're guaranteed to get 3 of the 4 cards that are not lands, and it's just so helpful in those moments where it can feel like, oh man, I have analysis paralysis. There's so much going on, and it's hard to make the correct decision. This is one of the cards I'd recommend that, if given the chance, you should always cast it. Moving on from that, I touched on earlier Gamble as a tutor card in the deck. This is another political card. I cannot tell you how many memorable moments I've had with this card at my group specifically, because people start to get a name for themselves when you play this card. The way that it plays out in my group, and I'd strongly recommend you do the same. So you search for a card, you put it in your hand, and then we put our hands face down so we can't see them, and we shuffle them, and then we pick an opponent who then picks one of the cards from your hand that is face down, and then you put that card into your graveyard. And this creates such a fun dynamic, because I have a friend named Ben who's become notorious for oh, don't pick Ben when you gamble, because he'll always select the card that you searched for. It can create really fun moments. It's also, me personally, having played competitive matches, having played casual matches, it can feel kind of bad to play a card that lets you search for the best card in your deck for a situation. Because, yes, I want to win, but I don't want it to be at the expense of the people I play with regularly. And it's frankly kind of boring to just search for the same card every time you're given the opportunity, and to just cast it without thinking a second thought. Sorry, had to get some water. Another notable part about this card is, because you discard it into your graveyard, you have other synergy pieces in the deck that allow you to play things from your graveyard, like Osteomancer Adept, letting you cast creatures from your graveyard. You also have Filth, which wants to be in your graveyard. Because of the addition of Filth, by the way, I added this card Compulsion, which is another card I haven't seen frequently, but I've run it in a good amount of graveyard decks, and it's just as good as it looks. It's not a card that that dominates the game. It's not a card that's super threatening or frustrating to play against. It just does exactly what you need it to do in the moment. Whether that's filtering out cards that are not useful at this time, or whether it's using it as a discard outlet so you can get Filth into your graveyard. Speaking of, another synergy piece. So we've touched on, there are some ways that Gamble is good because it helps put, Filth into your graveyard, helps you put creatures in that you can recur. Compulsion, also helps you put Filth into your graveyard, helps you filter out cards that you maybe don't need in this moment. But one of the big, expenses of this deck, because it came out to $154, 42 of that goes to Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth. And it's for a good reason. This card is incredibly expensive, mainly because of its, well, maybe not incredibly expensive, because of course there are thousands of dollar, cards that cost a couple grand. it's very expensive, especially in this context. But especially in a mono black deck, a deck that is just black, this card combos with another card called Cabal Coffers, which allows you to pay 2 and tap it to add black mana equal to the number of swamps you control. So, as you may imagine, if all of your lands are swamps, in addition to their other types, it can just be a huge boost of black mana. The reason I didn't put Cabal Coffers in this deck is because it's very expensive. One, it's like even more expensive than Urborg. But two, I found that in decks that have more than two colors especially, one of which being black, it's difficult to consistently get enough swamps on the battlefield for Cabal Coffers to be good without Urborg in play, and requiring that you have 2 lands in play in a 3-color deck that's not really based around lands. It's kind of like easier said than done, and it's also like, even if you do accomplish the thing you're trying to do, Mana Flare is 3 mana, and it doubles all your mana. It's comparable in what it's trying to do, and it requires less hoops to jump through. Anyways, sorry for getting a little derailed. So I touched on in that guide some of the more notable inclusions. I think that a natural place to take this video next are explaining what some mechanics are, explaining like what is put in the deck to help with your game plan that I haven't already touched on. Skyclave Relic, the kicker cost here, I noticed that there weren't any copies that had, the term is the Oracle text. Oracle text just means like it explains what the mechanic does next to the card. Like there are cards that'll say like this creature, it'll have haste, like like right here, and in parentheses it'll say like this creature can like be tapped the turn it comes down. So this doesn't have that. All that kicker means is that if you pay this cost, the 3 generic, then you get an additional effect. This is another card that's just great to have if you have just cast Battle Hymn and you don't really have a great way to dump the mana other than maybe activating your commander's ability. Paying 3 mana to guarantee that you have an extra 2 of this token on future turns. It's just great value. It's one of the better 3-cost mana rocks. That's a conversation that's frequently had in the commander community on just the idea that there aren't many good 3-costed mana rocks. Most of the time people are looking for 2-costed mana rocks. The term that people will often use is they either say mana value or CMC, which is converted mana cost. So yes. Anyways, I've touched on kicker. Moving on to the next card. We already talked about this a bit. A good amount. The cards that have been added to this deck so that filth can do what it's meant to do. Be filthy. I will say that this deck, it is certainly capable of beating face in combat. There are some cards that have been put in here. 1, this card is put in here because it's cute. But 2, it also gives all your creatures haste when they enter and makes them stronger. So, yes, this is another card that certainly these cards contribute to a powerful combat phase. But I'd say that this deck is like in its element when you can just play a rat and then just chill. Especially if people are building up their board states. Being able to just sit back, make your snail a little bit bigger each turn, and then when you reach a point where like, oh, I'm kind of running out of cards, blowing it up to draw, and then like kind of rinse repeat, continuing that process. This deck especially thrives in that environment. But that doesn't mean that it can't go quickly or that it can't, beat face in combat. I mean, something like Rolling Hamsphere is a prime example of, this card also synergizes with Impact Tremors, the card we talked about earlier. But it's a prime example of how this deck can definitely hang in combat. and it heavily encourages combat too, like coveted jewel, encouraging that people attack, and if they're attacking, their stuff's tapped, so you can attack them. Just a fun build, play pattern. Sorry, got a little tangled on words there. I already talked about gamble. Oh, okay. So this is a card I wanted to make sure I mentioned. So I know I already talked about how not Taurine Mauler, that Changeling means that this card is, of course, every creature type. This is an example of Oracle text, by the way. And an important part about that's not intuitive at first, and I touched on it in the guide, that this card is both a rat and a snail. So when you play Taurine Mauler, it's worth saying, ironically, one of the best rats in the deck, even though it is the least rat-looking rat out there. I mean, it's just not there. There's no resemblance. But I regularly have seen Taurine Mauler get to like 20 power in Commander games. And the only reason people don't remove it, is that it doesn't have trample. It is a big creature, but it's just people would say it's a vanilla big creature. It's not going to really push through damage unless you don't have a blocker. But in your deck, it becomes, what your opponent plays a spell, this gets a counter on it. Them playing a spell means you will draw one more card if you decide to sacrifice this. So each time your opponent plays a spell, it guarantees one more piece of card draw. And also, notably, you can recur this card. As we talked about, we have Osteomancer Adept, that we don't have a ton of ways to recur our cards. This is really the only way. And a big reason for why I decided to go that route, because of course, I mean, we have like Mudflat Village, so technically you could use that, to return that to your hand. But a big reason why I didn't lean too heavily into the graveyard recursion is it's just not the theme of the deck. It's nice to have some in the back pocket, but leaning into it too heavily, you risk kind of like the identity of the deck falling apart. Anyways, sorry. So I think we just about touched on everything we need to with Taurine Mauler. It's just one of the best rats. It's probably the best snail in the game. I think there's like 2 snails in the game. Don't tell the token that this is the best. It would break its heart. Anyways, so I touched on Displacer Kitten, but I talked about how it can help with Descent into Avernus, which is certainly true. That is one part of this card. But this card is famously very, very strong. It can protect itself by casting a non-creature spell. But we don't run a lot of instants, so that's not as relevant. We have some. Notably, I included Rat Out because, frankly, I thought it was kind of funny. It will, remove one-off creatures that are very weak. But I just love the art of this guy just throwing a rat from on top of this bridge. And someone's just like, trying to dodge it. It does what the deck wants to do. Spend a mana, create a rat. But anyways, spoilers. The reason this card is so good in general is there are a lot of powerful enter the battlefield effects. Your commander, of course, cares about rats entering. But notably, you could even flicker, that's the term. They use blink, flicker, when it exits the battlefield and then enters again. You could even flicker your commander. And because Wick counts himself or other rats. Even stuff like Ogre Chitterlord. There's a lot of effects in the deck that want to be flickered. So I think that's pretty much all we need to touch on for this. I mean, also the art's just really cute. It's a really powerful card, and it has an adorable little kitten on it. Okay, so of course, this card, Insatiable Frugivore, is in here because it's a rat. People in the community have talked about this card like it's a win condition. And although I can kind of see the vision, I think you have to be pretty late into the game for this to be an effect that will just outright win you the game. Because it is a good creature, and it is a rat. These are things we care about. But this second ability is where where people get polarized. When it enters, you create a food token, then you may exile 3 cards from your graveyard. If you do, you repeat this process. So you'd create another food token each time you exile 3 cards from your graveyard. And then if you were to pay 4 and sacrifice like 5 foods. So you've exiled a total of 12 cards because it gives you 1, and then you would get each time you exile 3, you would get another one. So if you got rid of sacrifice 4 foods, your creatures get +4/+0. They gain menace, so requires 2 creatures to block each individual creature that you control. This is certainly nothing to scoff at. This is an effect that certainly can win the game, but it requires that you have a pretty big board state already. You know, that you have cast your Song of Totes and Tans for a significant number. Which this also gives your creatures haste. It's worth mentioning. I just laughed because I just didn't even realize it in the moment. I just put it in there because tons of rats equal good. But to get back to this card, Insatiable Frugivore, it doesn't feel like it would be a consistent win condition. If you're in a spot where you could just use another rat, personally, I would not hold off and wait until your graveyard is full before playing this to get like the most value. You certainly could, and if you have a lot of cards in your hand and this is the only rat, perhaps it's worth it's worth waiting until a future turn to play it. But for the most part, don't think too deeply about it. Just, windmill slam the rat, profit. Okay, so I already talked about Manifold Insights. One of my favorite cards. Couldn't recommend it enough. So this is a card I wanted to mention. Bojuka Bog. A famous card in especially Commander circles. Kind of, in this day and age, kind of like bit of a debatable include. This card used to be a black staple. Like if you are in the color black and you're playing a casual game, you would include this card. Because it's a land, so it doesn't take up a slot of a spell. Theoretically, you could just remove a swamp from your deck to slot this in. But I found the fact it comes in tapped, a lot of lands come in tapped, but it's really just a basic swamp that comes in tapped if your opponents don't have graveyard synergies or like ways to recur things from their graveyard. I cannot tell you how many times I've been on turn like 3 and I need a land and I draw Bojuka Bog and no one has anything in their graveyard, and so I have to play a tap swamp that does nothing else. And I don't mind playing tap lands. Of course, I included a good amount in the deck, but those tap lands have the upside of being multiple colors. So like their floor is that they are more useful than Bojuka Bog. But it is really meta dependent. It's dependent on what your group's trying to frequently bringing to the table. If you're finding that you're losing games because someone is casting a living death every game, I'll look up living death real quick, just so you have some context. I'm not just dropping terms. Where each player exiles all the cards from their graveyard, sacks all their creatures, and then puts the exiled cards onto the battlefield. Just flipping the graveyard onto the field. If you're not losing to this card every game, it's reasonable to exclude Bojuka Bog from your list, but it is a good budget option. If you do need graveyard hate, it is like 60 cents when I looked it up before making this video. So that is a card I'd recommend looking into if you're finding that maybe people are in green and they're casting an Eternal Witness and returning something from their graveyard, playing it again, shenanigans. Then maybe we could look into adding it to the deck. I think I've covered just about everything I was looking to cover with this video. Oh, there is something I wanted to talk about. So, the inclusion of Thought Vessel and Reliquary Tower, both cards that give you no maximum hand size, is debatable in this deck. Because this deck does have ways to recur things from your graveyard, there are people that would argue that having these cards is a downside. Because theoretically you could put something in your graveyard and then later you could cast it still. And you could have a better card than Reliquary Tower in your deck. So in many cases I would agree with that logic, but because this deck doesn't revolve around getting cards out of your graveyard. It's not like we have like 7 effects that are actively trying to play cards from your graveyard. We have like a couple. We have a lot of ways to put things in your graveyard, such as like surveilling, which is look at the top 2 cards of your library, can put any number of them in your graveyard. Of course, we have discard. Yes, we have ways to put things in the graveyard. We don't have a lot of ways to get them out. But if you're finding that that's something you would like to lean into more, there are a good amount of budget options that we could include in the deck. They tend to, because they're budget, be a little bit more expensive and maybe sometimes even limited in what they can return. Thank you again. But after this video, I'm going to add some to your considering pool, just so if that is something that interests you, that you'll have the opportunity to kind of dabble in that without having to feel like you're venturing off into the dark on your own, trying to find things that are good enough to play but not too expensive. That can be a difficult situation to maneuver through. Anyways, I think we've covered pretty much everything and then some that I was looking to cover coming into this. If you stuck with me till the end here, I appreciate you commissioning this deck from me. I appreciate you listening to my long rambling. And if you ever need any help with this deck, I meant it when I put it in that guide that I don't know if I could do it forever. Maybe it's because I'm a bit on the smaller side as a content creator, but for the foreseeable future, I am more than happy to help any of my customers. If you have any changes you want to make to it, or if you even want to like rework the deck at some point, no change is too big or too small. It might result in me making another list and just like sending you that second list that is like a a different version of the same list. But maybe it's not the best business practice for me. But I just appreciate you choosing me for this service. And for me, that's how I show it.